A big problem with being in one's mid-30s, well, actually it's late 30s now, is that you realize that people often don't get your references anymore. So I don't know how many of you remember this, but back in 2001, there was this movie called Lagaan, which featured Amir Khan. And the basic premise was that there was this village in British India, they faced a drought, and the British rulers, for some reason, said, Teen gona lagaan chahiye, and for an even weirder reason said, let's play a cricket match around it. The movie was a big hit at the time. And so there's a scene at the start where the villagers see rain-bearing clouds approach and they break into an impromptu song and dance sequence like this. And then the clouds pass away while they're dancing. And this happens. Now, farmers, markets, investors, economists, RBI, government, we may not dance all that well in real life, but we are looking at the monsoons the same way as those villagers were doing. Why? Well, because there's something known as ElNino brewing. Now, if you think ElNino is like some kind of pasta that, like, can I have some ElNino with white sauce and chicken, please? I wouldn't blame you. So basically, ElNino means little boy in Spanish. It's the warming of ocean surface temperatures somewhere in the Pacific Ocean that does something to the atmosphere and basically increases the chances of drought in a number of countries, including India. Now, ElNino seems to be happening this year, which means that India is in the real threat of a drought. By the way, it may also not be as bad because there's another atmospheric thingy happening known as Indian Ocean Dipole, IOD. And look, I am not a meteorologist, so I will stop pretending that I know the science of it all. But basically, if you have an IOD happening at the same time as an ElNino, it lessens the negative impact of ElNino. So we don't quite know how bad the drought situation is going to be in India this year. But why does all of this matter? How exactly does a drought impact the Indian economy? Well, 4 things to watch out for. First, growth. If we have a drought, crops are likely to get hit. July is the month where India typically gets most of its rain in the year. It starts from June, generally ends in September, but July is when it should pour. So most people don't realize this, but July is probably one of the most important months in the year for our country. So if monsoons go bad, crops get hurt. And if crops get hurt, then the rural economy gets hurt. And if the rural economy gets hurt, consumption gets hurt. Mind you, the latest GDP growth for the last quarter of FY23, that's Jan to March, was over 6%. But consumption, which is close to 60% of GDP, is growing at half the rate, less than 3%. Why? Well, until now, consumer goods companies have been telling us how high inflation has really hurt the rural consumption. Now, most of them are optimistic of the future because inflation has come off. But what if rains poof up? Then a large part of our growth engine would essentially remain out of action. So check for things like two-wheeler sales, tractor sales, guidance from FMCG companies, which are usually indicators on how strong or troubled the rural economy is. Second, inflation. Now, you might think that it's very intuitive that if there is a drought, crops will fail. And if crops fail, then prices of food goes up. And the reverse, if there is good rainfall. But actually, it's a bit more complicated. Look, in the last few years, we've had decent rainfall, but despite that, food inflation has actually been pretty high. Basically, food inflation doesn't just depend on rains. It depends on a bunch of stuff. It depends on how much the government decides to buy or sell crops in the market, how high input costs have been for farmers. In crops like rice, where we export a load of them, global prices matter a lot. So there's actually a bunch of stuff impacting food prices. It's really a wait and watch thing, really. The drought may cause food prices to go up, but it's not a done deal. 3, the RBI. So look, the RBI raised policy rates from 4% last year to 6.5% currently and has kept it constant there even as inflation has been coming off. So we are currently at around 4 to 5% levels of inflation, which is not that bad actually, given the RBI's official target is 4%. Still, the RBI has its guard up. That is, it's still signaling that it could hike more if needed. Why? Well, because it's unsure of inflation. And why is the RBI unsure of inflation? One of the key reasons is ElNino. So until it gets clarity on whether rains are going to be okay or not, and if it will impact inflation or not, it is tough for them to take a call on interest rates. And 4, government. Look, this channel is not about being political. It's about explaining how economics impacts everything. So I could care less if you're supporting BJP, Congress, or any party. The cold, hard fact is that we have a bunch of state elections coming up in November and December. We have Telangana, we have Chhattisgarh, we have Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. And look, if the rural economy falters or inflation picks up too much, voters tend to get restless and politicians become collateral damage. So the question then arises, will the government step in and announce further measures to support the rural economy? By the way, we already spend a lot of money on subsidizing fertilizers, food every year. It's around 3,70,000 crore in this year, which is around 1.2% of India's GDP. Now, if you add to this what we also spend on the government's Rural Employment Guarantee or MGNREGA scheme, or say the PM Kisan scheme, which essentially has the government giving farmers 6,000 rupees every year, the total balloons to around 1.6% of GDP. To give a sense of how big that is, our capital expenditure budget, which is what the government uses to build infrastructure, is at a high of 3.3% of GDP this year. So you're essentially spending around half of what you spend every year on roads, railways, transports, on subsidies or money directly going from New Delhi to the pockets of the poor, particularly in rural India. And so it's not a small amount. The question is whether on the top of this, the government may want to spend more in case a drought hits and the rural economy gets impacted. Now, the question for economists and markets is, well, can the government afford it? So three things can happen. Either you might end up reducing your infrastructure spend to accommodate for this extra spending, but that will hit growth because currently government-led investment is a big contributor to growth. Or you can exceed your fiscal deficit target of 5.9% of GDP. This is broadly the difference between what the country earns versus what it spends, which is what a central government is roughly looking to borrow every year. So if you exceed your target, you may have to borrow more, and well, that has implications on interest rates, and there's a whole opening up of another can of worms from that. Or three, the government gets lucky. It gets enough taxes to spend extra on these measures. Look, I know watching the rain from a window might feel mushy and romantic. But if you're experiencing this moment with an economist, know that they are looking at the rains and thinking of something entirely different. For more such insights, like, share, and subscribe to the Bond Economist.